poor widow found a sick young woman with 3 children and discovered something that changed everything. The widow had been living alone for many years. Her husband had passed away suddenly, leaving her with nothing except memories and responsibilities. She had no children, no savings, and no one to lean on. Life became very hard after his death. At first, relatives helped a little, but slowly everyone became busy with their own lives. In the end, she was left on her own to face the world. She lived in a small rented room at the edge of the town. The walls were old, and during winter cold air slipped in through small cracks. The roof sometimes leaked when it rained. Still, she kept the room clean. Every morning she swept the floor, wiped the small window, and whispered a short prayer before starting her day. Faith was the only thing that gave her strength. To survive, the widow worked as a helper in different houses. Some days she cleaned floors, some days she washed dishes, and other days she helped with cooking. The work was tiring and the pay was very small, but she never complained. She believed honest work was better than asking others for help. Many people in the neighborhood knew her as a quiet and kind woman who never spoke badly about anyone. Even though she herself had very little, her heart was big. If someone needed water, she offered it. If someone needed a few kind words, she gave them freely. Sometimes she went to bed hungry, but she still thanked God for another day of life. She believed that kindness always returns, even if it takes time. One evening, after finishing work at a house far from her room, the widow began her walk home. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds. A cold wind blew through the empty road. Soon, rain started to fall, first softly, then harder. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked faster. As she passed by an old bus stop that had not been used for years, something caught her eye. Under the broken shelter, she saw a figure sitting on the ground. At first, she thought it was just someone waiting for the rain to stop. But as she moved closer, she noticed there were children too. There was a young woman sitting there, holding a small child in her arms. 2 other children sat beside her, pressed close to her body. Their clothes were thin and wet. The young woman's face looked pale and her eyes were half closed, as if she had no strength left. The children were silent, which worried the widow even more. Hungry children usually cry, but these ones looked too tired even to speak. The widow stopped. Her heart began to beat faster. She looked around, hoping someone else might help, but the road was empty. Rain continued to fall and the night was growing colder. She knew she did not have much herself. Her room was small and her food for the night was barely enough for one person. Still, she could not turn away. She slowly walked closer and gently asked the young woman if she was all right. The woman tried to speak, but her voice was weak. She said she was sick and had nowhere to go. They had been walking all day, hoping to find help, but no one stopped for them. The children clung to her, fear visible in their eyes. The widow felt tears form in her own eyes. She remembered her own days of pain after her husband's death, when she felt lost and alone. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She told the young woman to come with her, at least for the night. The young woman hesitated at first, unsure if she could trust a stranger. But the widow's gentle voice and tired, honest face gave her some comfort. Slowly, the young woman stood up with difficulty. The widow helped her, holding one child's hand while the others followed. They walked carefully through the rain until they reached the widow's small room. Inside, the room was simple. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a small stove, and a few utensils. The widow lit a small lamp, and its warm light filled the room. She gave the children dry cloth to wipe themselves and helped the young woman sit down. Then she prepared a simple meal using what little food she had. The children ate quietly, as if they were afraid the food might disappear. The young woman tried to stop them, worried they were taking too much, but the widow insisted. She told her that food shared with love never goes to waste. After eating, the widow noticed the young woman's condition more closely. She was burning with fever and shivering at the same time. The widow used a damp cloth to cool her forehead and gave her some warm water. She had no medicine, but she did what she could with care and patience. That night the widow barely slept. She lay awake on the floor, listening to the sound of the rain and the soft breathing of the children. Her mind was full of questions. Who was this young woman? How did she end up like this with 3 children? What would happen tomorrow? Fear also crept into her heart. She worried about how she would manage. She already struggled to feed herself. Taking care of 4 more people felt impossible. But every time fear rose, she pushed it away. She reminded herself that turning someone away in such a condition would be worse than any hardship. In the early morning, the rain stopped. Soft sunlight entered the room through the small window. The widow got up quietly and prepared some tea. The children woke up slowly and looked around, still unsure where they were. When they saw the widow smiling at them, they relaxed a little. The young woman woke up later. She looked around in surprise and then tried to sit up, but the widow gently told her to rest. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She thanked the widow again and again, saying she would leave as soon as she felt better. The widow shook her head and told her not to worry about leaving. She said life sometimes brings strangers together for a reason. The young woman listened quietly, holding the old locket around her neck as if it was something very precious. As the day went on, neighbors noticed children's voices coming from the widow's room. Some looked curious, others looked doubtful. The widow felt their eyes on her, but she did not care. She focused only on helping the sick woman and the children. She did not know it yet, but this simple act of kindness was the beginning of something much bigger. By opening her door to a stranger on a rainy night, the widow had unknowingly stepped into a story that would test her strength, reveal hidden truths, and change her life forever. And as the young woman slept peacefully for the first time in many days, the widow sat quietly near the window, unaware that fate had just entered her small, humble home. The next few days passed slowly, but they were full of quiet change. The widow adjusted her routine to care for the young woman and the 3 children. Every morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Before leaving for work, she made sure there was warm water, a little food, and clean cloth ready. Even though her body felt tired, her heart felt strangely calm, as if helping them gave her a new purpose. The young woman's fever remained high for 2 days. She was weak and could barely sit up on her own. The widow asked a kind neighbor for advice and borrowed simple medicine. She prepared warm soups using lentils and rice, stretching each ingredient carefully so it would last. She fed the young woman slowly, speaking in a soft voice, telling her not to worry. The children watched silently, their eyes following every move. The children were quiet at first, as if they were afraid to speak. The youngest stayed close to the young woman all the time, holding her hand tightly. The other 2 sat in a corner, whispering to each other. The widow noticed that they were polite and well-mannered. They said thank you for even the smallest thing. They never fought over food. This surprised her, because children who had lived on the streets often behaved differently. On the 3rd day, the young woman finally opened her eyes fully and smiled for the first time. It was a weak smile, but it warmed the widow's heart. She thanked the widow again and said she did not know how to repay her kindness. The widow simply replied that kindness did not need repayment. She said that when people help each other, life becomes a little easier for everyone. As the young woman slowly regained strength, small details began to catch the widow's attention. The young woman spoke gently and chose her words carefully. Even in sickness, her manners were calm and respectful. When the widow asked her to rest, she apologized for being a burden. She insisted on helping with small tasks, even though she could barely stand. One afternoon, while folding clothes, the widow noticed a small locket hanging from the young woman's neck. It looked old but well cared for. The metal was clean, and inside it seemed to hold something important. The widow did not ask about it, but she noticed how the young woman touched it whenever she felt worried or afraid. The children also showed signs that surprised the widow. The oldest child could read simple words and often tried to help the younger ones learn. The middle child counted numbers by drawing lines on the floor. These were not things children usually learned without guidance. It made the widow wonder about their past. At night, when the children slept, the young woman sometimes spoke in a low voice, almost as if she was talking to herself. She mentioned memories of a home, of safety, and of happier days. The widow listened quietly, never pushing her to explain more. She understood that pain took time to share. One evening, the young woman finally spoke more openly. She said that life had once been different. She talked about losing someone very dear and how everything fell apart afterward. She did not go into details, but her eyes filled with tears. She said she had trusted the wrong people and paid a heavy price for it. The widow sat beside her and held her hand. She told her that many people fall not because they are weak, but because life can be cruel. She shared a little about her own loss and how she learned to survive one day at a time. This shared pain created a quiet bond between them. As the days passed, the young woman began to help around the room. She swept the floor slowly and helped prepare food. The children became more comfortable and started laughing softly. The sound filled the small room with warmth. The widow felt something she had not felt in years, the feeling of family. However, worry never fully left the widow's mind. Food was running low, and her earnings were small. She skipped meals without telling anyone and drank more water to fill her stomach. She did not want the children to feel her struggle. She believed that their need was greater than her own. One afternoon, while the widow was away at work, a man was seen asking questions in the neighborhood. He described a young woman and 3 children. Some neighbors noticed and felt curious, while others felt uneasy. When the widow returned home, a neighbor quietly told her what had happened. The widow's heart began to race. She did not know if the man meant harm or help. That night, she gently asked the young woman if someone might be looking for her. The young woman's face changed instantly. Fear filled her eyes and her hands began to shake. She did not answer right away. Instead, she hugged her children tightly. After a long silence, she admitted that there were people from her past who wanted to find her. She said not everyone who looks for you does so with good intentions. Her voice was filled with pain and fear. The widow felt a mix of concern and determination. She assured the young woman that she was safe for now. She promised not to tell anyone about her without her permission. The young woman looked at her with gratitude and relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her heart. That night, sleep was difficult for both women. The widow lay awake thinking about the risks she was taking. She knew helping the young woman might bring trouble into her quiet life. But when she looked at the children sleeping peacefully, she felt certain she had made the right choice. The young woman, lying beside her children, stared at the ceiling. Her thoughts were filled with memories she had tried to forget. She knew that hiding forever was not possible. The truth would come out sooner or later. But for the first time in a long while, she felt she was not facing it alone. As dawn broke, a soft light filled the room again. The widow prepared tea and the young woman helped her. They worked together in silence, understanding each other without words. Both women sensed that the calm they were living in was fragile. Unspoken truths hung in the air. The widow knew that the young woman's story was deeper than she had shared. The young woman knew that the widow's kindness came with sacrifice. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was clear. This meeting of 2 broken lives was not a coincidence. Something hidden was slowly rising to the surface, and soon, the past would knock on their door, bringing with it a truth powerful enough to change everything. The calm of the following days felt different, as if something unseen was moving closer. The widow noticed that the young woman was more alert now, but also more tense. She jumped at small sounds and often looked toward the door. The children, sensing their mother's fear, stayed close to her. Laughter became softer, and silence filled the room more often. One morning, while the widow was cleaning outside, footsteps stopped near her door. A man's voice asked a neighbor if a widow lived there alone. The neighbor replied carelessly that the widow had taken in some guests. The widow's hands began to shake when she heard this. She quickly finished her work and went inside. The young woman noticed her pale face immediately. Before the widow could speak, there was a knock on the door. The sound felt heavy, like a warning. The children froze. The young woman stood up quickly, holding the youngest child in her arms. Fear returned to her eyes. The widow opened the door slowly. A well-dressed man stood outside. He looked around the small room with sharp eyes, taking in every detail. His tone was polite, but his questions were direct. He asked if a young woman with 3 children was staying there. He said he was looking for someone who had gone missing. The widow felt her heart pounding. She did not answer right away. She simply said that she helped people in need and did not ask too many questions. The man smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He said he meant no harm and left his contact details, asking her to inform him if she remembered anything. Then he walked away. As soon as the door closed, the young woman collapsed onto the floor. Her strength seemed to disappear. The widow rushed to her side and helped her sit. The children began to cry softly, confused and scared. The widow tried to calm them, though her own heart was still racing. After a long silence, the young woman finally spoke. Her voice was low and broken. She said the time had come to tell the truth. She could no longer hide behind silence. The widow sat beside her, listening carefully, knowing this story carried great pain. The young woman explained that she once lived a very different life. She had a comfortable home, respect, and security. Her husband had been a successful man, admired by many. Life had felt safe then. The children were born into warmth and care. She never imagined that everything could disappear so quickly. When her husband passed away suddenly, her world collapsed. She was left alone with her children, still trying to understand her loss. Instead of support, she faced pressure from people who were once close to her. They questioned her rights, her decisions, and even her place in the family. At first, she trusted them. She believed they wanted to help her manage responsibilities she did not fully understand. Slowly, papers were placed before her. Words were spoken that sounded kind but carried hidden meaning. She signed documents without knowing what she was giving away. Before she realized it, everything was gone. Her home, her security, her support, all taken through lies and manipulation. When she questioned it, she was threatened and silenced. She was told to accept her fate quietly for the sake of her children. Fear pushed her to leave. She gathered her children and left with only what she could carry. She believed distance would protect them, but without resources, life became cruel. The journey drained her strength. Hunger and illness followed them everywhere. The widow listened with tears in her eyes. She felt anger rise in her chest, not toward the young woman, but toward the injustice of it all. She could see now why the young woman carried herself with dignity, even in poverty. Her strength came from the life she once knew. The young woman admitted that the man who came to the door might not be there to help. Some people wanted to control her silence. Others feared the truth. She had been moving from place to stay safe. Her illness had finally forced her to stop. The widow took a deep breath. She knew then that this situation was bigger than she had imagined. Helping the young woman was no longer just about kindness. It was about standing against wrong. Fear tried to enter her heart, but she pushed it away. She told the young woman that running forever would only deepen her pain. She said truth, even when delayed, has a way of rising. The young woman listened, unsure. Years of fear had taught her to stay hidden. Hope felt dangerous. That night, the widow could not sleep. She thought about her own life, her loss, and the loneliness she had endured. She realized that pain changes people, but it also gives them understanding. She felt that fate had brought this woman into her life for a reason. The next day, the widow spoke to a trusted elder in the neighborhood without giving names. She asked general questions about help for people who had been wronged. The elder advised caution, but also spoke about honest advisors who could guide them safely. When the widow returned home, she shared this carefully with the young woman. At first, the young woman was scared. Her past had taught her to distrust help, but the widow reminded her that silence had already cost her everything. The children listened quietly. The oldest child asked a simple question that touched both women deeply. He asked if telling the truth would help them live without fear. That innocent question carried more wisdom than any advice. Slowly, the young woman began to consider the idea of facing her past. She realized that her children deserved more than constant hiding. They deserved stability, education, and peace. Fear had protected them once, but now it was holding them back. Days passed as they talked, planned, and prepared emotionally. The widow stood beside her, offering support in every way she could. She shared her small savings without hesitation. She reminded the young woman that courage does not mean the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. One afternoon, the young woman opened her locket and showed the widow what was inside. It held a small photograph and a folded paper proof of who she was and what she had lost. The widow understood then that this was not just a memory, but evidence. The young woman's hands shook as she held it. She said she had kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. She now believed that moment was near. The widow gently closed the locket and returned it to her, saying the truth would protect it. As the sun set that evening, both women sat quietly, watching the light fade. They knew the days ahead would not be easy. Challenges would come and fear would try to return. But something had changed. The young woman was no longer just running. She was preparing to stand. And the widow, who once believed her life was only about survival, realized she had become part of something far greater. The past had finally caught up with them, not to destroy them, but to give them a chance to reclaim what was lost. And with truth slowly finding its voice, everything was about to change. The days that followed were filled with careful steps and quiet courage. Nothing changed suddenly, but everything felt different inside the small room. The young woman no longer looked only afraid. There was now a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. The widow noticed it each morning when they shared tea in silence. Something strong was slowly waking up inside the young woman. They decided not to rush. The widow explained that moving with patience would protect them better than acting out of fear. She suggested they first gather strength, knowledge, and support. The young woman agreed. For the first time in a long while, she felt she had someone standing beside her, not behind her. The widow began by speaking quietly to people she trusted. She chose her words carefully and never shared full details. She only said that a woman had been treated unfairly and needed guidance. Some people turned away, afraid of trouble. Others listened but offered little help. Still, one or two showed genuine concern and shared names of honest advisors who helped people without taking advantage of them. Each evening, the widow returned home and shared what she learned. The young woman listened closely, holding her locket in her hand. The children sat nearby, drawing shapes on the floor or listening quietly. They did not fully understand what was happening, but they could feel that their lives were slowly moving toward something new. The young woman spent long hours remembering her past clearly. She wrote down dates, names, and events as best as she could. Sometimes her hands shook, and sometimes tears fell onto the paper. The widow sat beside her, offering water or simply staying silent when words were not needed. There were moments when fear returned strongly. On those days, the young woman questioned everything. She wondered if it was safer to stay hidden, even if it meant living in poverty forever. The widow never forced her. She only reminded her gently of the children and their future. The children themselves became a quiet source of strength. They asked simple questions about school, friends, and having a home where they would not have to move again. Their innocent hopes made the decision clearer. The young woman realized that her silence was no longer protecting them. It was limiting them. One afternoon, a trusted advisor finally agreed to meet, after much hesitation. The widow and the young woman prepared carefully. The widow stayed calm on the outside, but her heart was heavy with worry. She knew this meeting could change everything. They went together, leaving the children with a kind neighbor for a few hours. The journey felt long, even though the distance was short. Every step felt like a step away from fear and toward truth. The advisor listened patiently as the young woman spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. When she finished, he nodded slowly and said that what had happened to her was wrong. He explained that there were ways to seek fairness, but it would require courage, patience, and honesty. The young woman felt both relief and fear. Hearing someone confirm her pain gave her strength, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. The advisor advised her to stay safe and move step by step. He warned her that not everyone would be happy to see the truth come out. When they returned home, the widow noticed a change in the young woman's posture. She stood a little straighter. Her voice sounded steadier when she spoke to the children. That night, she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. Word began to spread slowly but carefully. Not gossip, but truth whispered in the right ears. Some people who had once avoided the young woman now looked at her differently, not with pity but with respect. The widow saw how powerful truth could be, even when spoken quietly. Of course, challenges came too. The same man who had come earlier was seen again in the area. This time he did not knock. He only watched from a distance. The young woman noticed him and felt fear rise again. The widow held her hand and reminded her that fear was expected, but it no longer controlled them. They became more careful but did not hide. The young woman began to step outside during the day. She walked with her children, spoke to neighbors, and slowly rebuilt her confidence. The widow watched proudly, seeing how far she had come. The children started helping more around the room. They laughed more freely now. Their laughter felt like light filling a dark space. The widow often sat quietly, watching them, feeling warmth in her heart. She realized that her life, once empty and silent, was now full of meaning. There were moments when the widow felt tired and scared too. She worried about the risks she had taken, but whenever doubt entered her mind, she remembered the rainy night when she chose kindness over fear. That choice had already changed lives. One evening, as they sat together, the young woman spoke softly. She thanked the widow not just for shelter or food, but for believing in her when she had almost stopped believing in herself. The widow smiled and said that sometimes helping others helps us heal our own wounds. Slowly, steps toward fairness continued. Papers were reviewed. Memories were confirmed. Support grew stronger. The process was not fast, but it was steady. Each small step felt like a victory. The young woman learned to speak without shaking. She learned to stand without lowering her eyes. The widow learned that her quiet strength was greater than she had ever known. Together, they were no longer just surviving. They were moving forward. As days turned into weeks, the small room no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like a place of preparation. Something new was being built there, not walls or wealth, but courage, trust, and hope. Both women knew that the final outcome was still ahead. Nothing was fully resolved yet, but they also knew that whatever came next, they would face it with open eyes and steady hearts. The storm that once chased the young woman was no longer behind her. It was in front of her, waiting to be faced. And this time, she was not alone. The final change did not come suddenly. It arrived slowly, like light entering a dark room through a narrow window. The days continued with patience, honesty, and quiet effort. The young woman stayed strong, even when the path felt long. The widow remained beside her, steady and calm, just as she had been from the very beginning. With the help of honest people, the truth finally reached the right place. The young woman spoke clearly, without fear hiding her words anymore. Every detail she had written, every memory she had carefully kept, helped paint a clear picture of what had been taken from her unfairly. It was not easy. Speaking about the past reopened old wounds, but she did not step back. During this time, the widow took on more responsibility than she ever imagined. She managed the home, cared for the children, and supported the young woman emotionally. Some days she felt exhausted, but she never complained. She believed that when life gives you a chance to do something right, you must take it, no matter how tired you feel. The children began attending a small local school. On their first day, they were nervous, holding each other's hands tightly. The widow walked them there, smiling with encouragement. When they returned home that afternoon, their faces were bright with excitement. They spoke about lessons, new friends, and dreams. For the first time in a long while, their future felt real. As the process continued, the people who had once silenced the young woman lost their power. Truth stood stronger than lies. Slowly, fairness found its way back into her life. She regained safety and stability, not through anger but through patience and courage. When the final decision came, the young woman did not celebrate loudly. She sat quietly, holding her children close, tears of relief running down her face. She had not only reclaimed what was taken, but also her dignity. The widow sat beside her, feeling a deep peace settle in her heart. The young woman did not forget who stood with her when she had nothing. She made a promise that the widow would never be alone again. True to her word, she helped the widow move into a safe, comfortable home. It was not large or grand, but it was warm, clean, and filled with light. For the widow, it felt like a gift beyond measure. The widow struggled at first to accept such kindness. She felt she had done nothing special. But the young woman reminded her that opening a door on a rainy night had saved lives. Sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The children laughed freely, ran without fear, and studied with focus. The young woman found purpose again, helping others who faced hardship. She understood their pain because she had lived it. The widow, who once believed her life was only about survival, discovered a new role. She became a guiding presence, a symbol of quiet strength and kindness. People in the neighborhood looked at her with respect. They knew her story now, and it inspired them. One evening, the two women sat together, watching the sun set. The widow spoke about her late husband and the loneliness she once felt. The young woman listened carefully, holding her hand. They realized they had both lost much, but they had also gained something precious, family chosen by heart, not by blood. The widow no longer worried about the future. She knew she would be cared for, but more importantly, she knew her life had meaning. Her kindness had changed not only another person's fate, but her own as well. The young woman often thought about the bus stop where everything had begun. She knew that if the widow had not stopped that night, the story could have ended very differently. That thought kept her humble and grateful. As time passed, the home they shared filled with warmth, laughter, and peace. Hard days still came, as they do in every life, but fear no longer ruled them. They faced challenges together with honesty and courage. This story was never about wealth or loss alone. It was about the power of compassion, about choosing kindness when it costs you something. The widow had nothing to give except her heart, and that was enough to change everything. In the end, both women understood a simple truth. Life may take much from us, but it also gives us chances to become something greater. One kind decision, made without expecting anything in return, can shape a future brighter than anyone could imagine. And so, the poor widow who once lived in silence and struggle found herself surrounded by love and purpose. The sick young woman who once ran from fear stood strong, holding her children and her truth with confidence. Their lives, once broken and uncertain, came together to form something whole, a story of courage, kindness, and hope that would be remembered long after the pain had faded.